people, and welcome to the show. I am sorry about last week. It was a little bit of a hodgepodge because we had so much going on. Of course, we had the massive passage of the American Rescue Plan, many other things, but I also had some travel of my own that I needed to take care of. So we are back to our regular schedule. Pete was on vacation visiting his parents with his family, and so we did Pam and Pete. Instead of on Sunday, we did it on Monday. I hope you check it out. It was a very good show. We talked about a lot of good stuff. But we're back to our regular schedule and back to our normal commentary and explanation of what all that is going on really means to you. Thank you for being a patron of the show. Thank you for listening. And of course, please tell your friends, your family, your crew, your posse to like, subscribe, share, proselytize, and of course, join our Patreon community. So for today, the first topic is the filibuster. What is really going on with that? And our second topic, I want to talk a little bit about what is going on with the migrant surge. The surge that ain't a surge, or more specifically, the crisis that ain't a crisis. And we'll talk about that. And of course, it is International Tuesday, so I have some updates and some commentary on some of the international headlines that I am watching on your behalf to keep you informed of why this matters to you. So let's start with the filibuster. We have now gotten past the American Rescue Plan, and people are starting to see some of the great things that are in that piece of legislation. It is an omnibus legislation, meaning it hits a lot of different topics. With Pam and Pete yesterday, we talked about one of those, which is help to African-American farmers who have been historically discriminated against, something that Lindsey Graham was really mad about. And of course, Tate Reeves, the governor of Mississippi, was really mad about the amount of money that was put aside to help his residents get health care, which he's decided to turn down. You explain that one to me, other than just being a cruel jerk. But that is now officially behind us, and now we have to take up the other big elephant in the room, which is the 235 pieces of legislation that have been passed through GOP legislatures or placed in GOP legislatures for vote to curtail, circumvent, stymie, suppress, and attack the vote of African Americans in particular, but Democrats in general, to help Republicans try to hold on as much as they can to the power that they have usurped from the people. Now, you know how I feel about this. I mean, I don't know if you've noticed, but I'm Black. So these pieces of legislation have a direct impact on me and people in my community, and so I have very, very strong personal feelings about them. But the reality is we have an absolute deal breaker. We have the Trump of all Trumps, and I mean that in the traditional meaning of the word, not the man, the action. To trump something is to supersede it. And in our law, federal law supersedes state law, which means that if we have federal legislation that pertains to the conduct of elections, then state provisions are superseded. That means that all of the unbelievably brazen attacks on voting rights can be swept aside with one fell swoop. That is a vote from the legislature, in the federal legislature, in the Senate. What is preventing that from happening? Well, obviously, the Republicans have what we call a right to filibuster. Filibusters basically was a procedural maneuver used in rare circumstances in the past to block legislation and to force extended debate of legislation that somebody had a real problem with. And really, it used to be that the filibuster was something that somebody on principle would stand and speak for hours and hours to elongate the debate and prevent cloture. And cloture is the procedure that you need to say, we're going to stop talking about this and we're going to go ahead and vote. If you can never cloture, if you can never close the debate, then you can never take a vote. And so it used to be that you actually had to hold the floor and physically talk and debate this thing, and over time, obviously, you couldn't relinquish it. So over time, you would just get exhausted, dehydrated, whatever, and you'd give up, and either a vote would be taken or not. But under the McConnell era, they took the requirement to actually stand up there and say something and hold the floor. They took that requirement out of the filibuster procedure, so you could just threaten a filibuster and it would have the same effect. Basically, what that did was it gave to the minority party a veto over critical legislation. But there were some exceptions that were made to the filibuster under Mitch McConnell's watch. Exception number one, obviously, was the budget reconciliation process, where you could not filibuster critical legislation to fund the government. Yeah, obviously, good reason for that. But then McConnell started to cut out all these other things that he wanted his team to be able to pass. Most importantly, the ability to seat ideological, nutty, and unqualified judges who were young. That's what McConnell, cut that out of the filibuster so that we could not stop him from doing that by using the filibuster procedure, which normally we could have done. He cut out what he wanted to make sure that we couldn't stop when we were the minority party. Now we're the majority party. Question, what do we want? The judicial thing is now off the table because they can't use a filibuster to stop our judicial nominees now. That, live by the sword, die by the sword. But now the question is, can they use a filibuster to stop a vote on H.R. 1 and H.R. 4, the two House bills that are the John R. Lewis Voter Protection and the For the People Act? These two combined, 1 and 4 together, protect not only African American voters, but also put in procedures that protect voters generally. Things like early vote and voter registration and anti-gerrymandering and all these other things. Really important, critical stuff for you to know. If you've not looked at the actual material in H.R. 1 and H.R. 4, worry not. Because tomorrow's show, we're going to talk a little bit more specifically as to what is in those provisions. But for today, I want to talk about procedure. Can these two pieces of legislation see the light of day in the Senate? And the answer is yes, if Democrats so demand. They will get a vote if Democrats act in concert to get it a vote. But that means they have to do something to the filibuster to make that happen. That's where we are. So, the point tonight is to talk about the options here. Option number one is do nothing to the filibuster and allow Mitch McConnell to block any kind of vote on the voter protection and allow all these draconian, racist state provisions to go into effect and stymie Democratic turnout and return power to the GOP. And any Democrat who agrees with that ought to be beheaded. I don't mean that in the physical sense. I mean that in the political sense. Okay, I don't ever subscribe to violence, but I do subscribe to political beheading. Any Democrat that thinks that that's acceptable needs to be politically beheaded. Option number two is to get rid of the filibuster altogether, which is Pam's favorite option, because not only will we need to get rid of the filibuster to pass voting legislation, we will need to get rid of the filibuster to pass every other kind of legislation. Background checks, you need to break the filibuster. Minimum wage, you need to break the filibuster. Green New Deal, you need to break the filibuster. You want to talk about any other legislation, you're going to have to break the filibuster. So, since we have now seen the cards played by the GOP on the American Rescue Plan, something that was popular with 70% of Americans and not a single Republican voted for it. So the theory that a Republican's going to vote for something else at some other time is ridiculous, right? So they have said they're going to vote for nothing because they can give Joe Biden no wins. So they're, let's just cut out the notion that they're going to participate. They're not. So, there's some Republicans like, well, if you don't break the filibuster, we'll work with you on immigration. No, you won't. You're a damn lie. No, you won't. Because you say that, you said you were going to work with us on the American Rescue Plan. What you did was you insisted on all these provisions that we voted on, and then not a single one of you voted for the final legislation. So Pam's view is that we need to get rid of the filibuster altogether. But let's say Pam doesn't get her way, which is often the case. What are the other options? Well, there are a couple other options that you could do in terms of changes to the filibuster that would allow for votes on H.R. 1 and H.R. 4. One of them is to cut a certain kind of legislation out of filibuster territory, such as voting protections or voting legislation or civil rights legislation, although that would have to be read either, because there's a lot of things that could be viewed as civil rights, but you would have to say it's directly on civil rights. For example, the Equality Act, which also passed the House, to say we're going to vote on that. That is going to be exempt from a filibuster. You cannot filibuster that. That is one direct, clean, simple way to deal with the problem. To date, I have not heard that Senators Sinema, Manchin, and Feinstein are open to that particular solution, but then again, the full court press has not yet been put on them about that. They've gotten some pressure, but not the full weight of the party, right? So that's option number one. Option number two is to make a temporary moratorium on the filibuster, to say we are suspending filibuster for X period of time, and we're going to pass everything that we can pass in that time, and then we reinstate it. It automatically springs back on a certain date. That is a possibility. I've heard some pundits talk about that and say, hey, look, if it's a procedural rule, again, this is one of the things that the Supreme Court doesn't tend to chime in on because it is internal to the procedures of the Senate. And if the Senate has the votes to pass it, then they do. And if they don't, then they don't. So if they have the votes to pass it, they could actually put a moratorium or a holiday on the filibuster and pass what they need to pass in that rubric. To me, that is a good option number two, because if you get your ducks in a row and you get your act together, there's a whole lot of things you could pass in that filibuster moratorium, right? Like you could pass minimum wage, gun control, Equality Act, some Green New Deal type infrastructure and all this other stuff. You could do a whole bunch of stuff in that window and get it done. The last option is the option that my friend Tom Gustafson and I chatted about at length today. Now, my friend Tom is a Democrat, but he's one of those sort of Democrats who was used to working with Republicans in a different generation, right? And he still believes that you can shame Republicans by actually exposing the deceitfulness of their arguments. And that is the last option, which is to modify the filibuster to require again that you actually hold the floor and actually debate and speak for the duration of this time. Now, Tom believes that would make them have to defend themselves over a period of time, and then public pressure would turn on them, they would be exposed, and then they would be so embarrassed they would vote for it. I just categorically disagree with Tom, because I don't think Republicans can be shamed. If they can't be shamed into admitting that insurrection on the Capitol and sedition is bad, I don't think you can shame them into believing that black votes matter. Like, I'm sorry. I just don't buy that. So the idea that you could, force them to hold the floor for all that time, they'll just do it. Right? There were little tricks and gimmicks when the filibuster was required, that kind of performative art in the past, right? You had teammates that were asking questions that were like 6 hours long so that you could, take a break, right? You had people who spelled you. There were little games that were played to extend the filibuster. I think that's exactly what the Republicans would do. And think about this. They view this as existential, that the voter suppression is existential to their capacity to win elections. Why the hell would they give up? I don't care how physically uncomfortable it is. They will just endure to ensure that the states rig the game to keep them in power, because they're willing to do anything to keep themselves in power, including storming the Capitol and defending sedition. So don't tell me that somehow they're going to swirl out conscience when it comes to votes of black people. Come on, man. Now, I love Tom. I respect Tom. I just disagree with Tom. And perhaps that's a generational thing. But I have watched Republicans look at clear evidence of abuse of power and say, we don't care. And then look at clear evidence of abuse, obstruction of justice and say, I don't care. They looked at clear, insurmountable evidence of sedition and say, I don't care. I'm sorry, but you're not going to shame them into caring about the votes of black people. I'm sorry. So that is where Tom and I differ. But where Tom is right, and sadly, I have no better answer, is that seems to be the option that Joe Manchin favors. Now, I don't know whether Kirsten Sinema agrees with him or Dianne Feinstein agrees with him. As far as I can tell, 99.95% of Democrats across America agree that the filibuster has to go. It somehow seems that the only 3 Democrats in America who disagree reside in the U.S. Senate. You may be able to explain to me how it is that we somehow managed to elect the only Democrats in America who do not have democratic instincts. And we put them in positions where they can stop the rest of us. I don't know how it happens. And for people who tell me we can't do better than Joe Manchin in West Virginia, I was like, well, we could definitely do better than Kirsten Sinema in Arizona. And we certainly could do better than Dianne Feinstein in California. Like, California, it's not like we couldn't get a Democrat who would get on board in California. Sadly, we have to deal with them in the short term. And Tom may be right. That may be the only way we get a vote to protect the votes of Black people. But where he is wrong is that Black people are going to be sanguine about the idea that we went to the wall to get Democrats a majority. And the way they treated the merits and value and importance of our vote was to put a Republican veto as more important than our voting rights. And that's what's the message that's being sent. What they're saying is they care more about Mitch McConnell's ability to stop legislation than our ability to vote people into or out of power. And that, I just don't think that's going to go over well. So we see how it all goes down. It's not like I have the 411 or the internal skinny on how this is going to go down. Your guess is as good as mine. I'm shocked that we're here, right? Because every micron in my body says, screw the filibuster. And I don't know any Democrat who disagrees other than the 3 in the U.S. Senate. So we'll see how that develops. Now, if you like what you just heard, you can find out so much more and hear so much more on my Patreon channel, patreon.com/Pam Keith FL. That's where you hear the rest of this discussion, and there's lots more to share.